So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us for this masterclass, Children's and Business Sectors. I'm Roberta Ruggiero. I'm a Senior Research and Teaching Associate of the Center of Children's Rights Studies of the University of Geneva. And today we will discuss about children's rights in this specific area of discussion together with my colleagues, Karl Hanson and Nehme, that will briefly introduce themselves as soon as they will contribute to the debate today. So what we are going to essentially do today in these 14.5 minutes is to present you a showcase. Children's rights and the business sectors is an area of large discussion and tension today, and we won't be able in 45 minutes to introduce and discuss with you about all the, I would say, the most critical aspects of it. So we picked three elements of this large field of discussion. I will start to introduce you to a discussion on children's rights and business responsibility, in particular addressing the position of the business actors in the CRC. My colleague Karl Hanson will talk about how we bridge between education and work, and the role of the business actors in this process. And Nehme will end the presentation with a discussion on the empowering of children's rights and the strategy in, I would say, successful strategy in fundraising and corporate partnership that pertains to that specific element. A lot of the material, or a large part of the elements and information that we are going to share during this presentation, they pertain to a study addressing children's rights in the business sectors that the Center we had the pleasure to carry out together with the Center of Business and Human Rights of the University of Geneva. It was a study that was conducted in behalf of UNICEF and the UN Global Compact in the two countries that you see mentioned, and the intention was to examine the company's awareness and implementation of children's rights all along their value chain, with, of course, the intention to also point out, identify good practices, challenges, and opportunities to improve the implementation of children's rights in these sectors. Let's start with my part. As I said before, I will briefly address the issue related to the position of the business actors within the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The PowerPoint moves ahead on its own, but this is where I wanted to start. I'll start with the discussion about, just a glance, about the legal analysis. I think that we have to take into consideration that the Committee on the Rights of the Child starts only in around 2010 to address, through his concluding observation, the issue of the role, the position of the business actors in relation to children's rights. But since then, is asking state party to adopt clear guidelines to, in a certain way, ensure that the business sector is working and supporting the protection and the respect of children's rights. There is no specific provision in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that deals with the business actor, that refers to them. There is an indirect one that refers to private actors that we find in Article 3, Paragraph 1, when the Convention is referring to the private social welfare institution, making sure that they work and operate, giving to the best interest of the child a primary consideration. What it means, the fact that we don't have a legal provision that refers directly to those kind of actors, in order to understand their position in relation to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we need to rely on soft law, this soft law statement adopted by the committee in order to go to interpret this Article 3.1 of the Convention. Here I'm basing my discussion on these three. The report of the day of general discussion adopted in 2002 related to the private sector as service provider and their role in the implementation of children's rights, and on two general comments, the number 14 and the number 16. 14th deals with the best interest principles, whereas the General Comment 16 focus on the state's obligation regarding the impact of the business sectors on children's rights. Both of them were adopted in 2013. To give you a glance, I think that in analyzing this material, three are the key components. The first one is related to the literal interpretation of Article 3.1. The committee is essentially, through this material, these documents, saying that when we refer to private social welfare institution, we need to apply a large interpretation. We don't talk stricto sensu about social institution, but we talk about all those organizations that through their action and decision might have an impact, influence children's rights and the exercise of these rights from the child point of view. The committee pushed those boundaries further ahead by saying that non-state actors and all members of societies, included the private sectors, are responsible, have responsibility for the fulfillment of the rights of the child as they are listed in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But in particular, General Comment 16 strike a balance, try to create a balance between the obligation of the states parties on the sides and the one that pertains the business actors. For what referred to the states party, he underlined essentially that those obligations are related to the adoption of a clear regulation imposing due diligence rules, and to monitoring the compliance of the business actors with those rules. Whereas for what pertains to the business actors, they have an obligation to respect children's rights, even in the absence of a legally binding provision at the international level that asks them to do so. And they have a negative obligation, that is the one to abstain from interfering with the state's ability of fulfilling their obligation under the CRC. The same approach emerged from the concluding observation issued by the Committee on the Right of the Child to the States Party reports. What I found interesting in the analysis of this concluding observation, I had the chance to observe, I would say, those concluding observations in a time span that goes from 2010 until today, is still that even though the committee started this discussion, I would say rather early, about the business sectors and their impact on children's rights, the committee today still concerned about the fact that the business sector's accountability still relying on the voluntary voluntary obligation and self-regulation and self-reporting, and still absent a framework, a legal framework that regulates, that impose legal consequences on the business actors on violation of children's rights. On the other side, while referring to states party, even though during the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, States Party adopted national plan of action that translated into national legislation international standards related more in general to business and human rights. Today, the committee is still recommending and claiming for the adoption, for the setting up of what is called an enabling environment at the national and possible at the international transnational level. That includes the adoption of a regulation with clear guidelines, monitoring procedures on the work of the business actors, the increasing of their accountability through more transparent procedures, for example, through the collection of data about the impact of the work of those actors on children's rights, but last and not least, referring to the necessity to set up procedures that are meant to redress or compensate for violation of children's rights caused, perpetrated by the business actors. The same approach is replicated, I would say, no matter the specific business sectors the committee is observing or analyze. So we have the same dynamics if we talk about the tourism industry, the environment-related issue, and their impact on children's rights and their connection, of course, to the work of the business actors, and the digital environment more recently. But what works in reality? Referring to the outcomes of the study I mentioned before, what works in reality, I would say that the committee is issuing this recommendation, is claiming and asking states party to develop this enabling environment for business actors, because essentially it's what proved to be effective. It proves to be a good practice. More than the 50% of the actors that were analyzed in the studies we undertaken in collaboration with the Center on Business and Human Rights are saying that they are more inclined to engage with due diligence processes and procedures if a national binding provision is obliging them to do so. Couple of conclusions to end my part. Based on what I said before, we can definitely say that the business actors are agents of the implementation chain of children's rights, and they are indeed third parties of the CRC. The committee essentially did the following process, in my opinion: extended the provision related to the privatization practice to the business actors. It didn't reduce the state's obligation to ensure that children's rights under the state's jurisdiction, at least, have full recognition and realization of their rights, but at the same time recognize, in my opinion, three levels of obligation that are in relation to the business actors. The first one I mentioned before is this necessity to respect children's rights, even in the absence of a specific legally binding provision. The negative one, so they have the obligation to abstain from interfering or limiting the state's ability to fulfill completely their obligation under the CRC. But there is a third one that is emerging and I would say more frequently today in the work of the Committee on the Right of the Child, and is the one to support states parties to strengthen their implementation and respect of children's rights at the national level. And in my opinion, is something that is particularly evident in two general comments that were not included in my list before. The one, for example, the last one adopted last year, the 25 on the digital environment, and the committee engaged in a discussion with the business actors in this field to ask for their involvement and support, and was something that characterized the adoption, the drafting procedure of this general comment. And I think that we will have sign of this kind of request of support to business actors, also in relation to the next general comment that we'll adopt, the new one that will be probably adopted in September this year, about children's rights and an healthy environment. Karl, I'll pass the microphone to you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Roberta. And so I'm Karl Hanson. I'm the director of the Center for Children's Rights Studies, and what I'm going to do is try to convince you, or illustrate at least, that children's rights studies is also about taking some critical distance of a field, and so looking at it in a reflexive manner. Now, let's see how what this brings us to work, or the world of business and the world of child labor. So this is, like I would say, the archetypical message that even, well, when you think of the business world and children's rights, we then think, oh, businesses, they should end child labor. And this is how, well, this has been the common way to represent it. The UN Global Compact asks your company take concrete actions to end child labor. Now, if we continue, we even see that there is some help from the ILO, UNICEF, who are in fact the international organizations that mold or that prepare the thinking, the framework in which we think. And then you have a campaign like this one. It's a very short clip. when I first saw the clip, I thought I was in the 80s somewhere, but it wasn't. It was taken in 21. And it is, well, the white saviors complex that sits in it. We have these kids dressed up in white, and they're going to save the world by take a stance against child labor, and we are all invited to do so. Now, I think this is extremely problematic, the kind of message that is there. And even you could, well, take it a bit further on and say, well, who are the working kids here, in fact? Are it the kids dressed in white who are singing because they work, they have to take off leave from school to make a big tour to sing against child labor, to save them. These poor kids we saw in the video, in the clippings, they were working in the field, and they might be the ones that needed to be saved from child labor. Now, and I'll come back to it, but I'm extremely worried and critical about these kind of taken for granted messages that are spread around the world to say we should and we must stop child labor, and businesses, you can help us with getting there. And I think that is, as I said, extremely problematic. Now, the problem lies relatively deep, is entrenched, and probably not in these 15 minutes that I will solve it. I can show where even one of the underlying problems lies. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted, with including 8.7, there is an alliance 8.7 that wants to end child labor by all its forms, not by 2030, which is the end goal which is the goal set for the Sustainable Development Goals, but by 2025. Now, really, this is not realistic. This is a totally unrealistic goal, and it still is well, it puzzles me how people who did some studies and who were, if you just think for 2 seconds, you would know that you cannot promise today that by 2025 you will eliminate all forms of child labor, and I think that is a problem. Now, where does this idea comes from, or what is then, from a more child rights perspective, the problem? Well, when we take a deep breath, when we go back to the ILO's, so the International Labour Organization's child labor policies over a longer period of time. And in fact, already from its start in 1919, but throughout the 20th century, most of the time, the ILO had a kind of a realistic framework in mind. They said the overall goal, our ambition is to end child labor at the long run. They call this the two-plank approach, stating we want to effectively abolish child labor, well, but we know this is not going to happen as long as the economic conditions of many countries and many situations don't change. So we also include a short-term objective, which is we want to improve the conditions under which children work, or here I'm protecting working children as a short-term ambition. Now, since the mid of the 90s, and especially since the years 2000, the ILO's policy has changed and has now abandoned the second objective. So we still have the long-term objective to abolish child labor in all its forms at the long term, but at the short term there's no more talk of protecting working children. We only speak about immediately eliminate the worst forms of child labor. And this, of course, in a world where children work, is extremely problematic, because nobody is looking really at rights of children who are at work. We don't look at how to regulate child work, maybe eliminate or at least diminish the most harmful positions of it. But so the only thing we are left with is we will end child labor by 2025, and even the organizations that are supportive of this ambition, the International Labour Organization, but in the latest report also UNICEF says, well, we need to progress 18 times faster than we did between 2000 and 2020. Just to say, setting unrealistic goals is in fact itself extremely problematic. Now, underlying it lies a problem, and I would say it's a problem of conceptualization about child labor and education. And here is another example of an NGO or a coalition of NGOs together with unions and North-South workers. They say we have to stop child labor. School is the best place to work. So you see school and work being proposed, suggested as total opposites. It reminded me, when I saw this last one, of a publicity made by a Swiss company, Migros. Dates back from 20 years ago. They had this in the newspapers, written on a chalkboard in a classroom. This is what we think of children's work. So children's work is sitting in a school, and there's where they work. And so you come up, and which is well, what I present to reflect upon a bit further, is the way how we represent. So the agenda, abolish child labor by 2025, and companies should work with that to end all child labor by this totally unrealistic within this total unrealistic time frame, starts from the idea that work and education, they are separate. Children, they belong in the world of school and education, and adults belong in the world of work. And this is how if you accept this way of representing the world, then you can think of course, let's set then as a goal that all children should be now in education and no one left in work. But it is, well, I'm sorry to say, but it is a wrong representation. It is a misrepresentation of the world. As if the business sector is adhering or is following this kind of misrepresentation, I don't think what they can accompany is much, in the sense that if all businesses, international businesses to whom these campaigns are addressed, would stop hiring children, then maybe the number of child workers would diminish by 5 to 10% maximum, because it is not in the export industry that the masses of children are working. They work at home, they work in the fields, they work in the local market, they do small jobs after school, and all these kind of things. That is not where business sectors intervene and how they can, in fact, they have no tools, and their role would be extremely limited. Now, which is why I do think to start it all over and to try to figure out what would be a real role for the business sector and child labor, and in this debate, is that we would start again from a more realistic representation of the world. And that one, it's not a revolution, it's just the way how things are. We consider work and education as they're not two separate fields. Think of today, we are having a day on continuous education, which is we invite the world of education, of continuous education, to the world of work, and vice versa. We have all these very interesting, fascinating concepts of lifelong learning, of training during your life, of durable resources, of how you get your workforce trained during all its career. Work and education are in fact not at all separate, and considering them separate is a mistake. I do think work and education they are overlaps. Once you accept that, and once you accept that children who work are part-time workers, they work sometimes, they learn things better while they work than they do at school, sometimes it's different, and once you accept that these are not very separate entities, you might start thinking anew what the business sector and what role business sector can have in bridging education and work with maybe a much more realistic idea. So not by 2025 to abolish all child labor, which is not going to happen, and it is not true, and it is not meant to be true. On the contrary, what is possible if you start from a representation of the world where education and work are, whilst maybe sometimes they are antagonistic when we have the debates about how far should we train people or young people and give them some academic liberty and not just prepare them for the job market. But at the other hand, we also admit that the right to education of young people has to do also with giving them the potential, or giving them potentially access also to valued jobs and to the job market. So if you look at the right to education, what role then can business sectors play? Asking the question is, in fact, the reply lies in the history of the business sector itself and of schooling itself. If we go back to the 19th century, the business sector has been extremely powerful in helping vocational schools to be created. And until today, the business sector is indeed very active, is itself also demanding upon the educational sector to provide workforce for future useful work for the business sector. So in fact, rethinking the right to education and the business sector and work, I do think there is many things that can be done and thought of. A second field where I think business sector can play an important role in bridging education and work is in the respect for rights of young workers. Because with all the emphasis on the end of child labor, even within the international framework today, the minimum age of child labor is 15 years. There are exceptions, even to 14 years for light work. So it means that, legally speaking, you have 15 to 18-year-olds, young workers who are entitled to work, who are not counted amongst the child laborers. But I have seen very, very little international attention from UNICEF, from the ILO, from many other actors who would say, and I campaign, I fight, I try to improve the conditions of young workers, which is, I would say, a category of workers we hardly look at, because, well, we are so much looking at the abolition of child labor, and we forget that there are 15, 18-year-olds who are working, who have, well, what about their payment? What about their right to leave? What about their right to education while they are working? And I think there's a huge amount of work that the business sector can invest in thinking about how do they treat their youngest workers as a workforce. A third field where I think businesses have an important role to play is looking at the conditions of work, and the agenda of eliminating all harmful work for children. You can think of removing children from harmful workplaces, but you can also think of how can I improve harmful workplaces to make them into decent workplaces, that young people, 15, 16-year-old, who might now be working under harmful conditions, in some sectors it is totally possible to change the conditions under which people work and to turn it into an acceptable form of labor also for young people. And there is a whole body of work that needs to be done. And finally, or the last position is the notion of the apprentice, which is a fascinating person. The apprentice is both employed by a company and is both still seen as a student, as a learner. So the apprentice is, I would say, the figure who bridges education and work in one person. And to open up the apprentice and this statute, and to see how the apprentice is also useful for businesses, because, well, he gets salary. We know that being as an apprentice, that's the way how you get socialized. You learn from the inside a job, and you also still have a status as a student and as a worker. And I think within the apprenticeship and the attention we could have in improving the conditions under which apprentices work, how are they socialized, how are they remunerated, what are their rights and obligations as apprentices, I do think there's a boulevard still of actions that can be taken. Now, to conclude my small part, I hope I gave you a glimpse of what we mean with this notion of children's rights studies, saying, well, we don't need to take necessarily everything for granted and just say this is the policy objective, so the only thing we can do is try to reach the policy objective. I do think we need to also think further underneath what kind of conceptualizations lie under these policy objectives, to try maybe to reconstruct something which is more feasible, which is closer to a world and a representation of the world as it exists. So thank you, and I'll pass the floor to Simon for the last part of our presentation. So Simon, it's up to you.
Hello everyone, I'm Simon Nehme. I am Scientific Associate at the Center for Children's Rights Studies and the coordinator of the continuing education under the Children's Rights Academy of the Center. What I want to talk about today is related to empowering children's rights and looking how to successfully doing that through our fundraising and corporate partnership strategies. I decided first to look at how the business sector funding contribute for children's rights. I looked at one example only, but I think this can be replicated into other organizations. So I looked at the UNICEF 2020 income worldwide. By looking at that, we can see that the private sector contribution into the 3 billion, I think more, fund of UNICEF during that year, 22% out of it was from the private sector, meaning $1.6 billion. It's a huge amount, I must say. Out of this 1.6 billion, when we look at how this is distributed in terms of which part of the private sector this money came from, we see that businesses account only for 13% versus individuals where the percentage amount to 62%. So individual contribution, people philanthropy is still way more important in terms of contribution to fundraising from the private sector. These numbers should and must be improved, because the impact of the business sector funding is great on the empowerment and the advancement of children's rights overall. As we can see, and here again I quote UNICEF, through a partnership with 2,859 businesses who delivered only $211 million in this year, they were able to reach 133 million children. So imagine if this funding was greater on the impact it would have on children and children's rights. When we look at corporate social responsibility, and here we define as corporate social responsibility as the responsibility that corporates have towards towards its investors, its clients, and its other stakeholders. Often children are forgot as also stakeholders into this corporate social responsibility. And we can see that when we look at the value chain of businesses. So looking at this value chain from the supply perspective, children in the environment are affected by companies' operations. Looking at the workplace, children and their caregivers are the producers of goods and the services that the companies are providing. If caregivers do not have adequate working conditions, it for sure will influence their children. On the marketplace level as well, children and caregivers are consumers of goods. This affects their health, this affects their well-being, this as well affects their environment overall. So when talking about corporate social responsibility, it is a management style that is important not only to advance children's rights, as we see here, but if I look at a study conducted by Stoyan and Gilman, they showed that this style of management not just have a positive impact on small and medium enterprises, it actually also increases their growth and avoids their sales decline. So it's a key element when it comes to advancing children's rights, but also advancing growth in companies. I will take just one aspect of this corporate social responsibility and will focus on philanthropy, which is the act of support that companies provide through funding to organizations or funding sometimes to their own philanthropies. We looked at this in Switzerland and Liechtenstein in our study, and we saw that 2/3 of companies engage in philanthropic activities. However, when we looked at the areas in which these companies engage, we realized that it is mostly related to provisional rights from the CRC. So we see a lot of contribution in education, in the humanitarian relief programs, in health programs, in climate and environment, water, sanitation, and hygiene. However, when looking at other very important rights for children, be it protection or participation-related rights, the numbers are really low. So almost 0% of companies engage in participation-related activities and programs for children, and as low as 6 to 7% in protection programs. When looking at the size and importance of these two programs and their impact on children, we realize that, for instance, if we want to combat child labor, investing in social policy in child protection is important. So there is here a discrepancy, and this discrepancy often comes with a major risk. Why do people engage in philanthropic, why do businesses engage in philanthropic activities? Is it for the benefit of children's rights and the advancement of children's rights, or is it to basically as a tool of marketing or a way to evade or wash up other infraction of children's rights that their business might be doing, be it tax evasion, be it very bad work conditions, the supply chain being environmental infractions. There is a wide range of infractions that sometimes companies try to cover by engaging in philanthropy. And this should not be the focus. Therefore, when looking at philanthropy and corporate social responsibility, we need to focus on 4 main goals and approaches. The first is to view corporate social responsibility and philanthropy as part of the business model of the company, and the responsibility toward children's rights as a core responsibility. Again, if I look at the study, none of the companies almost that we interviewed referred in their text to children's rights, to the Convention on Children's Rights in their bylaws, policies, or corporate social responsibility strategy. It is essential to take this at hand and to ensure that children are represented into these actions. Second is to ensure that corporate social responsibility and philanthropic activities are effective and has a positive impact on children, and ensuring that it is a holistic package that the companies are looking at. So not looking at just philanthropy in order to cover 4 other infractions. And third is to conduct transparent reporting and monitoring of these activities, be it from the company's side or from the philanthropic organizations that are being supported. And lastly, the 4th level is to allocate more resources toward projects that address participation and protection. Participation is at the heart of understanding what children want, how to realize children's rights, and how to ensure that children's living rights are being reinforced. And this is where more resources need to go on the short and longer term. I thank you all for your participation. There is a reference list for the documentation we use in our PowerPoint. And we are open now for your questions. Yes. Do we have questions?
Simon, thank you for your presentation, and also thank you to Professor Hanson and Dr. Ruggiero. A question maybe more about your programs. Could you tell us more about your continuing education programs for this year, and then what you have in store for the future as well? Thank you.
Sure. Go ahead, Roberta.
Hi, thanks for the question. But as it was visible, I think, from the first slide, we just set up an entity in our center that is the Children's Rights Academy. And this is the unit of our Center for Children's Rights Studies that is dedicated to the continuing education. The programs, I would say we have programs that can be classified on 4 categories at the moment. So we have certifying programs like the Master of Advanced Studies on Children's Rights, or a DAS on Mediation, that is a French one, that is together with CAS, composing, and together with other trainings. I don't do the entire list, I think it will be long too. Is composing our certified trainings activity, the portfolio of certified activities. Another category is the one of related to qualified trainings, our executive trainings. Those are more short trainings programs that are dedicated to professional, and soon we are going to promote one, for example, on international child protection that we are developing in collaboration with colleagues of the Department of International Private Law of the Faculty of Law of the University of Geneva. There are plenty of new activities that are in other trainings, but again, I don't do the list. We have also a MOOC, a massive open online course, an interdisciplinary introduction to children's rights that is on Coursera. And of course, we support actors that have a specific learning needs through trainings on demand. So this is, I would say, the composition and the structure of the portfolio. There will be more activities that will come soon, also through the social media, and we are going to, of course, launch the Children's Rights Academy the 2nd of October of this year. And so I hope everybody will remain connected so that we will be able to keep you on board and informed about the activities that are coming ahead on these 4 levels, I would say, of trainings, trainings that are dedicated on advanced studies, that are dedicated explicitly to professionals in these fields at the international and also, I would say, at the national level. Thanks.
If I might just add shortly, the next upcoming summer school in children's rights would be also an interesting event for many of you, especially for an international audience. It gives you a good introduction on different aspects related to children's rights, and this will be in June this year. Registration is now open for those interested. So I think we can do the closure of this session. It was really a pleasure. Thanks for Gabriel and the team from the Continuous Education Center for supporting us in organizing this masterclass and the Porte Ouverte. And we welcome anyone interested in our programs to go on the CDE website and get to know more about our events and the education programs. Thanks, everyone.